So we are very excited to welcome here on the stage 4 countries that are really on the front line of what is happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We have with us Pekka Haavisto, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, Zbigniew, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Tobias Lindner, who is the Minister of State in Germany and has been intimately involved in everything Germany is doing to have a more assertive foreign policy. And we will also have with us very shortly Tobias Billström, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. He is stuck in a car on the way from the State Department, but he will be with us shortly. And no one better to interview this unbelievable panel than our own Peter Spiegel from the FT. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Anya. It is my great pleasure to share a stage with such a distinguished panel. It is a little bit, for me, going home again, because I spent 6 years in Brussels covering European defense and security policy. So it's a great pleasure to share the stage with such a distinguished panel. Now, obviously, just one housekeeping matter. At the last 15 minutes, I'd like to take some time for Q&A. I'd like to go to the rising leaders, so if you're in the room, please be prepared for questions coming at you near the end of the panel. Many of the people here on stage last week were in Bucharest for the foreign minister's ministerial for NATO. Bucharest chosen symbolically as the place where both Georgia and Ukraine were told that they would become NATO members eventually, an event that some critics have argued provoked what we have seen over the last 10 years in Ukraine by Vladimir Putin. There was a statement, I would argue, of unity. There was a reassertion that both Georgia and Ukraine would eventually join NATO. But I want to start with the Polish minister, Minister Rau, because Poland has, I would argue, been perhaps the most vocal ally of Ukraine within the alliance. And around the time of Bucharest, we had the French president, Emmanuel Macron, talking about peace talks with the Russians again, with Putin again. We had even the president of the United States suggesting peace talks with the Russians again. And although there was a very strong statement of unity coming out of Bucharest, the noise around it suggested that support in some countries is weakening. How concerned are you, as perhaps the most vocal ally of Ukraine within the alliance, that you are no longer leading a unified alliance on this?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation to the conference and to the panel. Let me reverse your question, or at least my answer. I do believe that what the Russian aggression against Ukraine achieved, contrary to the expectation of Mr. Putin, is an exceptional unity of the free world and exceptional unity of the transatlantic community. This is something that, quite frankly, we couldn't expect a year ago. Of course, within the transatlantic community, there are different perspectives coming from the location of various member states. Naturally, that we are on the eastern flank of NATO, given our different historical experience, given our geopolitical situation, are much more sensitive to Russian imperialist policies than our friends and partners in Portugal or Spain. But this goes without saying that so far we can count on the unity of the alliance as a whole. Of course, you have to realize that the main task of Russia in the last couple of decades, as far as Russian European foreign policy was concerned, was to divide us. And the assumption was very simple. The more divided we are, the stronger Russia is vis-à-vis continental Europe. The problem is whether Russia gave up right now this mode of thinking. I'm sure they did not, but it's much more difficult for them to achieve this end than it was the case before the Russian aggression. What the Russians are after, it's more than clear to us. I mean, to paraphrase the first Secretary General of NATO, from the Russian perspective, the optimal situation would be to bring the Russians into Europe, to paraphrase Lord Secretary General again, to have the Germans up and to have the Americans out, certainly. And thank heavens, it's not working.
Can I push you a little bit on this, though? Can I push you a little bit on this, sir? Because I was in Brussels during the 2014 crisis, Little Green Men, Crimea, and I remember at the time, the Polish government, in particular the Lithuanians as well, some of us heard from the Lithuanian Prime Minister last night, were frankly very angry at the French, at the Italians, because they saw very quickly after the initial takeover of Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk, that the Italians and the French wanted to return to normalization of relations, essentially. Are you at all concerned that as this war drags on, and perhaps this winter, because there will be some political issues given energy supplies in Europe, that we were seeing a weakening of some of the weaker links, for lack of a better word, within the alliance?
Well, everything is possible in politics, but it's possible, but I would say rather unlikely, because we are at a different stage of this historical development here. First of all, the Russians, by this act of aggression, destroyed the previous security architecture in Europe, and not only in Europe. The other thing is that you cannot see a true war fatigue that so many representatives of the media used to talk or write about. And the most important thing, I believe, is our knowledge of the atrocities that have been committed, and our strong belief, regardless of the place where we live in what part of the free world we live in, is that these war crimes have to be punished because there are people responsible for that. So if you put all these three elements together, there is no going back to business as usual. I mean, in terms of considering Russia as a part of the security architecture in Europe or in the world.
Minister Lindner, can I turn to you on this tough subject? I mean, Minister Rao uses the phrase war fatigue and perhaps accuses us in the media of paying too much attention to it. So be it. Let me pay a little bit more attention to it. But one of the countries that I think we in the media focus on quite a bit is Germany, because of Germany's historic reliance on Russian gas, the nervousness about energy supplies during the winter. We have seen some signs of protests in the streets of some anti-war sentiment. And frankly, we're watching it here domestically as well. There were signs of the Republican Party, the incoming Speaker of the House, perhaps. We'll see how that plays out. Talking about that they're no longer a blank check for the Ukrainians. How concerned are you that domestic support within Germany and other allies like the U.S. is beginning to weaken, and that this winter could be a tough one for domestic political support for continuation in Ukraine?
Yeah. So good afternoon. I'm glad to be back in Washington. Thanks for the invitation to this conference. Honestly, I'm not that much concerned. You know, as my Polish colleague said, in a democracy, everything can happen in the end. But I believe that the majority of Germans, we have learned our lesson. For too long, we believed that due to mutual trade relations, be it gas, for instance, you can influence political stability, and that was proven wrong. And I'm convinced many Germans see, for instance, if you look on gas supply, who has stopped the gas supply? Those were the Russians, for instance. So I think the lesson learned is Russia is not anymore a reliable partner, be it on a political issue, as my Polish colleague said. the war in Ukraine is terrible, but what's happening goes beyond Ukraine, since Putin is putting the whole international security order at risk. And that's the reason why this war is also affecting us. And therefore, our assessment is Russia cannot be a reliable partner anymore, even after this war might have ended, because we had to learn Putin is a man who is doing in the end what he is saying. That's the hard lesson learned out of February 24th for many Germans, but I believe they have learned their lesson.
Can I ask, sometimes we forget that your socks are indeed the color of your party, and that Germany is a coalition government, and the chancellor is SPD. And the SPD has a somewhat, shall we say, checkered past when it comes to relationship with Putin in particular. You know, ex-Chancellor Schroeder is on the board of Gazprom, is very close with President Putin. Tell us a little bit about the coalition dynamics on this, because the Green Party has been, in many ways, the most hawkish within the coalition. And I think that Chancellor Schulz's statement on German defense spending took a lot of people by surprise, given their history. Talk a little bit about that relationship and whether that's still as strong as it seems from the outside.
So, besides everything that was written in the media, the coalition, you know, today it's the first anniversary of the coalition. 1 year ago, at that time, I was sworn in as deputy minister. So the coalition is working, it's stable. I think we have proven that we are able to adjust our policies. I think 1 year ago, no one could have imagined that we are spending in a special fund 100 billion euros to equip the armed forces. And as Chancellor Scholz said in an interview this morning, we are committed to the 2% goal of NATO because we are convinced it's necessary in these times.
Let me turn to our Finnish and Swedish colleagues. I spent quite a bit of time in Helsinki, and I remember asking various politicians, even pro-NATO politicians, about whether Finland would ever join NATO, and they said no, never. This is never going to happen. And there was always the old joke that with Sweden in particular, the Swedes are willing to fight the Russians down to the last Finn, which is they were in together, out together. Let me just ask you briefly about the change. Just tell us a little bit, because we're not on the ground there, the remarkable change in attitudes within Finland. And Finland now, once it becomes a member, will have the longest, I believe, border with Russia, and has for years, even outside the alliance, been forced to train for and prepare for a potential Russian invasion, given history, the Winter War. What do you think Finland brings to the alliance, given that experience with your Russian friends?
Well, thank you, and thanks for the good question. And I forgot my green socks. Sorry about that. Coming from the Green Party. Yes, we made this kind of, I would say, it's a big change in one night in Finland. And the night was, of course, February 24th, when we saw and witnessed Russia trying to change the government in a country of 40 million people in our neighborhood. And then we were thinking that what's happening if Ukraine cannot defend themselves? And what kind of risks there exist with these non-conventional weapons, when we suddenly started to hear about the nuclear weapons, about the chemical weapons, and so forth. Finland, as an only country in the world, has been keeping this, what we call the NATO option. I think nobody else has a NATO option. But since 2004, we have been saying that if the security environment changes in Europe, in our vicinity, we are ready to consider about applying NATO membership. That has, of course, been also the message to Russia, that if something changes to that direction, we might consider our situation. And so we did, and we luckily got Sweden on board. I remember the first calls to Sweden when we were telling that we have been thinking maybe applying the NATO membership, and we got the answer, no, Sweden has been 200 years neutral, and so forth, a long tradition of neutrality. But then luckily we agreed actually to apply the membership together. You referred to the border. We really have more than 1,300 kilometer border, and people are asking, are you concerned about the long border? And our answer is that we would be concerned if there wouldn't be any border between us. So it's good that there is a border. And we want to keep the border peaceful in all circumstances. So what we are bringing to NATO is a peaceful border, and it hopefully will remain like that.
Can I ask the same question I asked Minister Rao? Because there is a word in foreign policy discussions which I learned is a dirty word in Finland. I learned the hard way when Prime Minister Stubb yelled at me about it, but Finlandization. And I think outside of Finland, this is viewed as a way for a country to survive next to a much larger, powerful country without basically creating an alliance with anyone else. And there have been suggestions, including, again, from the French president, that Finlandization of Ukraine is an option. Tell me, first of all, why Finlandization is such a dirty word within Finland, but also your experience as a quote-unquote neutral country neighboring Russia, with the lessons you've learned on that neutrality and how difficult that is.
Well, of course, now when we are joining NATO, hopefully, we will not be neutral militarily. We will be part of the defense alliance. But political alliance, European Union, we joined in 1995, so we actually dropped that idea of neutrality in our own minds in 1995 when we joined European Union and took all the political positions of European Union. But of course, before that, the time we describe as neutrality. And something that we sometimes as Finns remember was 1975, the Helsinki Security Conference, the beginning of the OSCE and so forth. And then there's this big debate in Finland that was this, the highest or the lowest point of the neutrality. There are many opinions. Some people say that somehow, made the bloc, Eastern and Western bloc, visible and accepted the current status quo in Europe. But then there are voices who say that this was exactly the time when Helsinki groups were formed in many countries to advance the human rights, and actually the third basket of the OSCE started to be functional. And I tend to a little bit go towards that description of the situation, that even in the darkest time of the Cold War, actually probably the Helsinki Security Conference triggered something new in Europe, and particularly in the Eastern Europe, triggered these new groups. It signaled much more better the influence, but many groups were thinking that finally they can speak about the human rights, finally they can speak about the freedom of the press, finally they can speak about the freedom to move over the borders and so forth. So hopefully that triggered something, but the debate is ongoing still. There are different interpretations of our history, what was good, what was bad during those years.
Let me bring in our Swedish colleague, Minister Billström. Thank you for suffering the traffic of Washington and getting here. I want to ask, obviously, a similar question. Obviously, feel free to defend my besmirchment of the fine Swedish military, but I want to talk a bit about the membership process, because we are in a place right now where the initial problem with the Turks still lives with us. We don't know if Turkey, where they stand on ratification. The Hungarians now seem to have added their name to the list of difficult countries in terms of ratification. Talk to me a little bit about where you think the process is right now, perhaps even your discussion with the Americans on this, and perhaps timing. Do we think that it's happening in a good time that you had expected?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor. It's the first time I'm addressing the Aspen Security Forum, so it feels really good to sit up here and talking about the Swedish and Finnish NATO accession process, something which we are very keen to see a successful ending to. The meetings here in Washington today have been very productive, I have to say, especially now with Secretary of State Blinken, but also the meetings I had yesterday with lots of members of the Senate. My belief is that we are well underway with the fulfillment of a trilateral memoranda that was signed in Madrid during the summit this summer. This is something which Sweden, Finland, and Turkey have a responsibility for, no one else as such, but of course we welcome very much the support of not only the US, but also all the other NATO states that have spoken up in favor of Sweden and Finland. The fulfillment is about fulfilling all the conditions laid down in the memoranda. And that has to be done through various dialogues between not only ministers, but also with authorities. And we also have to make some changes. One example of this is that we have to change our constitution, which is going to happen when the Swedish Parliament starts working on this after New Year's, to the aim of making it easier to punish those who carry out terrorist activities on our territory. Now, this may sound like an obvious thing, but the question boils down to this: is it a right to promote terrorist activities? And we are changing our constitution to make it making this a crime. There is also a question about delivering military material or defense material to Turkey, and that's also going to happen. We have a special authority on this as well, an independent authority in Sweden, and that also has to be done. But as I said, we are well underway to fulfill all the commitments that we undertook with the trilateral memorandum. And when that is done, the parliament of Turkey can go forward with the ratification process. So this is where we stand now. You mentioned Hungary. Well, the message coming out from Budapest is that they are also ready to ratify. They will start doing this by the end of January, February, when next year, when the Parliament comes back after recess. And so far, I think that both Pekka and I are looking positive of the promises, the public promises given by the government of Hungary. Thank you.
Can I just push you a little bit on the Turkey front? Because let's be honest, Erdogan has not been the most consistent in his messaging on what he wants from Sweden in order to support accession. How confident are you that once you go through the list you went through, that Erdogan will eventually tick the box?
Well, you know, when you sign a memorandum, like the one we did in Madrid, you make public a certain number of commitments that you have to fulfill. But you can't move the goalposts around. You have to stick to what's laid down in the memorandum. And this has been a clear message from the Swedish government to the Turkish government, that we are going to do everything which is written into this memoranda to the last letter, within the limits set by the Swedish constitution, legislation, and basic principles of rules of law. But we're going to do everything. And we also look on this memoranda as some sort of starting point for a new relationship between Turkey and Sweden and Finland. But again, I think that you have to stick to what is written into the memoranda and not add things or dream things up or come with expectations which cannot be fulfilled.
Minister Haavisto, before I change topics, I just wonder if you would want to weigh in on this. I mean, obviously, the Turkish issue tended to be more about Sweden. Just if you share the same optimism, both from Turkey and Orban in Budapest.
Well, I think, first of all, the tripartite cooperation with Turkey has been functioning quite well on the expert level. We had one meeting in Helsinki, tripartite meeting in end of the summer in August. Then we had just maybe a month ago in Stockholm another meeting. And on the expert level, things are going very well. And this is the feedback we are getting from the Turkish side as well. Our Minister of Defense just yesterday and today visited Ankara and so forth. So also the bilateral cooperation is going on. But you are right. It's Turkey has a system where the President Erdogan is the decision maker on this issue, and he decides when the Parliament will deal with this issue. We of course hope that this could happen in the coming 2 months, January, February, because before that there will be the election period in Turkey, and that will postpone the Finnish and Swedish membership. And of course, in the current conditions in Europe, you don't know what's happening next. And it would be much better not to be on the grey zone like Finland and Sweden currently on the waiting room, but the member of NATO also covered by Article 5, but also giving the security that we can give as Finland and Sweden, particularly to the Baltic Sea region.
Let me change the subject and start with Minister Lindström as the representative, I think the only representative of an original member state of NATO. As Minister Rao mentioned, the first Secretary General of NATO said the alliance's purpose was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, the Americans in. And what we have seen over the last 10 months is the Americans are way back in. This is an alliance, as Minister Rao said, that is unified. But let's not forget, there was not too long ago that there's a president of the United States who threatened to pull out of NATO, would show up at summits and be frankly rather rude to the chancellor. And at the time, I remember Chancellor Merkel and her series of French counterparts were talking about reinforcing the European arm and whether the EU, in particular, with the Brits now out, needed to figure out on its own how to defend itself on its own. Talk to me a bit about that dynamic, because obviously there's a relief now, I sense, in Europe that the Americans are back, but President Trump has announced that he's going to seek re-election. And from allies in East Asia to allies in Europe, I sense that the assumption that for 60, 70 years the Americans are always going to be there has to be reevaluated. Is that something you think about, despite what's going on now when we see a sign of American-European unity?
So let me make 3 comments. The first one would be, I'm an ordinary state minister, and no one who is able to predict the future or the elections in 2024 in the United States. But I'm convinced that also from American perspective, and this is also true when you see that the US are very much caring about the Pacific and about China, that also from American perspective, it's in their own interest that on the other side of the Atlantic, there is a Western liberal system of democracies and that there is peace. So it's a mutual interest that the Transatlantic Alliance lives, holds, and is credible. But my last comment would be, and I think that's the main point, that Europeans have understood very well that we have to strengthen the European pillar inside NATO. And I'm totally convinced that also a closer cooperation within the European Union on security and also on defense policy is not a contradiction to that. And it's also in the interest of the United States that the Europeans are more capable of protecting security on the European continent. I think that's a message that is well understood. That's the reason why our government has decided to invest hugely into your armed forces and to our commitment in terms of capabilities to the alliance, especially to the eastern flank. So in the end, I would say whatever will happen in 2024 here in the United States, it is also in the US interest not to put NATO and Article 5 into doubt, while at the same time we have our responsibilities and our obligations to do more.
Can I ask you just to talk a bit, and this may be a slight obsession with mine, so I apologize to the audience, but you said that Germany is still committed to increasing the capability of the European pillar. But you also did mention that you want to see that also done through the EU. We obviously have 2 EU members who used to be out of NATO who are now back in, but we have one very big member who's now out, which is the UK. And if you talk about capable militaries, traditionally it's been the Brits and the French. The Germans are now stepping up to where they're becoming a top-tier power as well militarily. Can you just talk about squaring that circle, how you increase the European pillar within NATO, but also at the same time strengthen EU defense without the most important European military or one of the most important European militaries within the EU? And does that complicate your effort?
So if you want to do this effective, and if you want to strengthen European security and defense, not in a contradiction to NATO, not in parallel processes, this means 2 things. First of all, the European Union can do things that are complementary to NATO, especially when it comes to, let's say, crisis management, stabilization, peacekeeping missions, especially in Africa. And during my time here in DC, I very well understood also the American wish and demand towards the Europeans to be responsible for that. Second, I'm urging for more European cooperation to fulfill our capability goals within the capability planning process of NATO. So don't do your own process in terms of capabilities. Don't double structures, but do it more effectively, spend the money better. I think that's also in the US interest.
Minister Rao, can I turn to you and ask the same question I asked originally, which is, how much you can rely on the US as a reliable NATO ally. Now, the Polish government, when Trump was in office, I guess went a slightly different direction in that they tried to really embrace Trump. President Duda invited him to Warsaw, talked about Fort Trump potentially even being set up in Poland. And yet, Trump himself did not seem to warm to the idea of being an active member of NATO. How concerned is Poland that the U.S. is no longer a reliable ally, given the political situation domestically here in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, there is no doubt in our mind that the Americans are absolutely indispensable in Europe. We cannot imagine Europe defending itself alone without the sense of strong responsibility and the sense of community of the whole transatlantic community. But I would like to comment a little bit on the question you have just asked my German colleague. We also, just like the Germans, strongly believe that the European pillar of NATO has to be strengthened, because we also believe that the transatlantic commitment is a two-way street. Each country, first of all, has to take responsibility for its own defense and do its absolutely everything possible to strengthen its own armed forces. And having done that, has every reason to expect support from the allies and partners. But the first thing is to take responsibility for our own defense. So, for example, we in Poland are going to spend 4.2% of our GDP next year for our military expenditure. 3% of it is going to come from the state budget, and the rest from extra budgetary sources. Well, and this is how we understand the strengthening the European pillar. That's the only way to do it. Of course, we are not against, looking for purely European or EU solutions concerning and forms of cooperation concerning our defense. But usually it's better to put yourself to work at home, find the necessary financial means, and then have a reasonable plan how to defend yourself, and then look for another form of European cooperation. It's absolutely necessary. We do realize that there are many issues that we Europeans can arrange ourselves without waiting for our partners from outside, from the other side of the Atlantic. Nevertheless, on the eastern flank, we realize very well that if we are talking about an effective defense, so deterrence and defense, without the common effort of all NATO members, it's absolutely impossible to achieve.
Let me do this horrible journalistic habit of trying to put words in your mouth, just so I can push you on this point. What I hear you saying is you would prefer if the European members of NATO first lived up to their NATO commitments on spending 2% of GDP on defense before we start thinking about EU structures and EU defense cooperation. Let's wait for that later. Let's make sure the allies live up to their alliance commitments first. Is that what you're saying?
Well, my point is that this is our Polish experience. And if we are talking about the fair burden sharing, and if we are talking about the responsibility for our own security and for the security of our allies, so it's absolutely necessary to think in the first place about your own defense. Because how can you be a reliable NATO partner if you don't have the means in terms of the weapons, for example, or to help others, right?
Minister Rell, let me stick with you for one last topic before I go to the audience for Q&A, which is energy security. Again, my recollection from my time in Brussels, anytime your Polish diplomats in Brussels would hear my American accent, they would say, why don't you Americans talk to the Germans about Nord Stream? You are bypassing us. This is not something we support, and why aren't they being good allies? This is an argument that Poland has been making for a decade, and now we finally come to a point where I think the rest of Europe has woken up to this fact and is trying to diversify away from Russia. How confident are you? Well, let me ask you, do we think we started too late? And how confident are you that the transition is happening now, that we will see alternate sources of energy in time for if not this winter, next winter?
Well, let me elaborate first on our previous attitude, because you were referring to Nord Stream 2. I mean, the difference between us and our European partners, above all Germany, was that we didn't treat Russia a reliable, trustworthy business partner. Neither did we treat them a reliable political partner. And this was the reason for the fact that we were pursuing a completely different policy as far as our energy security was concerned, right? So as far as the winter is concerned, this is your question, right? Well, it's not going to be easy, but nevertheless, we took in Poland precautions to assure that our population will not suffer from the lack of, say, electricity or the lack of heat, or people would not be in a position to afford it, because there are certain systems that helps every kind of security and also the business community to survive this difficult time. And we are proud that we introduced this extra measures, but to the best of my knowledge, we are not the only country in Europe that is turning to this kind of measures. It's our common European experience. Perhaps some of us are doing this in a more radical way, like Poland. Some others who are richer and have richer societies, so do it in a slightly different way. But quite frankly, of course, in every democracy, there is a fear that the society is going to lose its patience when the prices of, say, electricity, for example, or heating are going up. Nevertheless, we have to take into account the fact that the Ukrainians who are fighting for the same values that we cherish are paying enormous price. So our problems with, say, higher prices of heating or electricity, higher electricity bills cannot be compared to the sacrifice they are making.
Let me ask, Minister Lindner, I will get to you on this point, but maybe give you the last word on it. Let me turn to our Finnish and Swedish colleagues on this first, because it was an EU issue post-2019 about how Europe was going to wean itself off Russian gas, and Finland and Sweden were part of that discussion. If I remember correctly, there was a debate about, for instance, LNG terminal that actually was going to go to Finland, and there was a long discussion about it, a long debate about it, and the Lithuanians said, you know what, we're just going to build one. Tell me a little bit about your view about Europe's response to 2014 and whether there was a window that was missed to try to get alternative structures, alternative pipelines, alternative facilities that could have paid us in good stead during this crisis.
Well, maybe first, if I go today's situation, we have ordered a LNG ship to the south of Finland. It's coming during these weeks. So actually, we are replacing the Russian gas. They cut the pipeline last spring. We have a pipeline called Baltic Connector with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, so we can share gas with these countries. And now we will have an LNG terminal that will also pump gas if needed through this Baltic Connector. So our pipeline to Russia is no more in use, and our system is based on the LNG. We also stopped our Rosatom project. There was a nuclear power plant project in the northern Finland, and it's now fully stopped. Will never rise again, I would guess so. We have other nuclear power plants that we are using, and so our energy production seems quite stable. It's of course a situation where the energy price is rising because of the global market, but energy security is there, and we think in Finland that energy security will be a key issue also for the whole European Union. Then actually going back to the 2014, maybe not so much about the energy, but about the reaction. I have been in many seminars where reaction has been that why didn't we react already 2014 when the occupation of Crimea happened? And I think even President Erdogan in one of those seminars in Turkey reminded us that we should have been more active at that time. I'm all the time thinking that where was the front those days. If we had been sending troops or military help or something like that, where was the fight? Actually, the whole change of the regime in Crimea happened in a way that it surprised us all, but it surprised also the Ukrainians themselves. And since then, Ukraine has been building their capability of defense and so forth. And now I think it's extremely important that we support and continue support also militarily Ukraine in these circumstances. And just I want to reflect that this cannot happen without the support of the US. European Union is doing its best, but we definitely need in continuation the US support to that. And I think we should continue this support as long as Ukraine needs that support.
Mr. Billström, I want to stay on this topic of energy security, and obviously feel free to weigh in on this, but obviously there's another issue here, which is there seems to now have been actual kinetic activity when it comes to pipelines not far from your waters, your neighbors in Denmark, where it does appear the Russians have been putting landmines or sea mines into some of the pipelines there. Tell me a little about how that has been digested by your government and whether you are now looking at additional naval capabilities or other kind of capabilities to deal with what does seem to be an active effort by the Russian military to sabotage supplies to Western Europe.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to stay a bit away from this question because in Sweden we have independent prosecutors and they are carrying out an investigation, and it would be very inappropriate of me as a minister to, come very close to this with any kind of speculation of who done it or for what reason and etc. So, if you pardon me, I will stay a bit away from this question until the final report is being delivered by the prosecutors. Then perhaps we can talk. But you are right that this is a security concern, and that, of course, has to be addressed. Now, we are thinking a lot about this in relation to our neighborhood. And this is exactly one of the reasons why it's so important that Sweden and Finland become NATO members. Because when we are NATO members, all the states who have a coastline around the Baltic Sea will be NATO members, bar one, Russia. And that's going to increase the security and the safety for everybody who are inhabitants of this area. And I'm looking to Germany and to Poland here, who are also, close neighbors to us, very close also to this pipeline, etc. We have to think very much about what's going on, not just on the surface, but also below the surface in the years to come. And we are ready as an incoming NATO member to do our part of the job. We have a good Navy, and we are going to build on that. And as has been stated before, the government's ambition is to reach the 2% goal by 2026 at the latest. And this is a public statement that has been made already by the Prime Minister, but I'm repeating it here as well, so that you know it.
All right, Minister Lindström, as I promised you, I'll give you the last word of it, and then we'll go to the audience. I guess this is a little unfair to the CDU to ask a Green politician, but there does seem to be a rethinking of Angela Merkel's tenure as Chancellor in light of decisions made since 2014. And she herself has become very defensive in interviews in the German press about this. Do you think it's fair that we reassess Angela Merkel's tenure as Chancellor because of some of the decisions she made to continue relying on Russian gas through her tenure?
Coming back to the color of my socks, because the Green Party was always opposed against Nord Stream 2, so it would be somehow too easy for me sitting in a chair, being 1 year in office, and making too much comments about the chancellorship of Angela Merkel, because with the knowledge from today, also she would have done many things different than with the knowledge at that time. I think the important point is to have the lessons learned out of what happened. I think the main lessons are deterrence and defense are key. So we are really back at collective defense. For too long, we have structured our own armed forces being ready for deployments to Mali, to Afghanistan, to Iraq. Let me emphasize peacekeeping missions. Such deployments will be still necessary, but our armed forces need to be capable to defend ourselves and to guarantee the security of our friends and allies. The second lesson learned out of what happened is, for too long we have to be one-sided dependent on Russia on economic terms, that kind on fossil fuels. So the answer must be that we need to have an approach to security that also embeds economic relations, that reviews economic dependencies be it on fossil fuels, be it on rare materials, be it on semiconductors, you name it. So for me, the emphasis is about lessons learned and adapting these lessons learned quickly to our policies. And last comment, that's the reason why at the moment we are drafting for the first time a national security strategy for Germany and also a China strategy that should review both and draw the right consequences.
A very diplomatic answer. Thank you very much. Let's go to the audience. We have about 5 or 10 minutes left, and I see one of our rising leaders right here with a hand up. Can we get a microphone right here with the gentleman in the red blazer? And please just introduce yourself as you ask the question.
Nathan Dial, U.S. Air Force pilot, officer, and Aspen Rising leader. So there's an ever-changing definition of security, and while Article 5 is the ethos and the keystone of the NATO alliance, the alliance's ever-present function is coordination between the members in terms of military capabilities and policies. Myself and 2 colleagues in the program argue that one of the new frontiers for the alliance is energy security. And namely, we argue that the alliance as a whole needs to bolster its nuclear energy, specifically a position on it, because it's very absent in the NATO alliance of policy. There's a no nuclear proliferation position in terms of weapons, but there's not a nuclear energy direction or position from the alliance. So one of the benefits that we saw of Sweden and Finland accession into NATO is that both countries power 35% of their energy grids via nuclear power. And so I would just pose to the panel, would love to hear your position on energy security within the alliance and the potential of bolstering nuclear energy in light of many NATO allies' dependence on Russian oil and gas.
Really good question. Let me start with you, Minister Haavisto, because as you don't have the socks, but we now have 2 green ministers up here to talk about nuclear power. Talk a little about maybe your parties, but also Finland's view on this, and also whether there should be within the EU more reliance on nuclear to solve some of these issues. But also, there seems to be a suggestion that this should be perhaps a NATO issue, that because energy security is an issue of national security, that perhaps the EU is only one forum that should be discussed, that actually the energy mix should be an issue for the alliance itself. Would you mind weighing on that?
Well, maybe 2 remarks on nuclear energy. First, when this Rosatom decision was made almost 10 years ago, we actually as Greens walked out from that government because we were thinking that nuclear power was maybe a negative issue, but particularly it was an issue to increase our dependency on Russia. And that time our conservative politicians were in favor of having a Russian nuclear power plant. And now everybody came to the same judgment that this was not a good idea. But also from our side, my party, and this that differs us from the German Greens very much. In my party, the younger generation started to re-evaluate during the climate crisis the role of the nuclear power in the energy production and came to the conclusion, and actually we have a party congress majority in favor of the nuclear power plants in our Green Party. And that's of course a big difference towards many other Green parties. And I fully agree with your argument that this, I mentioned it should be a common topic on the European Union level, the energy security, but definitely on the NATO level as well.
I know this was asked of our Finnish and Swedish colleagues, but I hope you don't mind, Minister Lindner, if you could address this as well, because the debate within Germany is quite interesting, and the Green Party plays a very interesting role in that debate. Your thoughts on the role that nuclear could play in an energy mix, and how difficult might that be for Germany?
You know, this is something which is really different to the Finnish Greens. We are opposed to nuclear energy. Germany will phase out of nuclear energy by the middle of April in the latest. But we have respect if other countries make different decisions, to be blunt about that. I think from a European perspective, you need to keep in mind where the nuclear fuel comes from. And there are some large European countries that get a majority of their nuclear material, which is needed for the reactors, still from Russia. There are reasons why there are no sanctions on nuclear fuel at the moment. So, but the issue you are addressing is about energy security. It's about autonomy in some sense. And as I said in the beginning on our dependencies, I believe the answer is diversification on short term, saving gas, but on the mid and on the long run, we are speeding up our green transition. And you know, we are the 4th largest economy on this planet. We are convinced if we can prove that we are able to do it at affordable prices and with a reliable energy system, then it's also a good example for others to follow. And it's also good for the climate, by the way.
I must admit, I don't know the position of the Swedish moderates on nuclear power, but can I get our Swedish view on this?
Yes, indeed. I think this discussion about security and energy being tied together is extremely important, and we believe from the government that I represent that we should expand nuclear power, and we have plans to do so. Just as our colleagues in the government of Finland, we believe that this is, the way forward. We have to become independent on this. We are a small, export-dependent nation. Without seeing to it that we can deliver safe, secure and clean energy in the future, this will not be possible to sustain our finances and finance our welfare. But on the other hand, and I do agree with you, that also calls into the question uranium. We do have uranium that could be mined on Swedish territory. So this is something which we also will have to look into, the mining legislation, etc. And we have to do this in a holistic way, I think. We have to understand and come to terms with the fact that nuclear power is the only alternative for a country like Sweden. We can use solar power, and that will be done as well. We can use wind, to some extent, but these are not reliable because of the fact that Sweden has a geography, we are geographically situated in a zone of the earth where we don't have enough solar hours per year to sustain our energy needs. So this is all being brought in by the new government, this new policy. And we're going to see to it, especially the question about how to finance new nuclear reactors. This could be done by the state offering credit guarantees. And this is also something which we are in a close cooperation and dialogue with the Swedish industry on. Thank you.
We only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to give Minister Rao the final word on this one.
Thank you. I would like to say that the gentleman who asked the question connecting the energy security with other kinds of security and was put it in the NATO framework is absolutely right, because our decision in Poland as far as the nuclear energy is concerned is based on a wide political consensus. We are very much in favor of nuclear energy. As you probably know, we are in the process of decarbonization of our energy mix. We are going to replace it with carbon with nuclear energy. Choosing our partners in this endeavor, we were following 3 premises. One had a geopolitical character, very important in terms of security, understood as a very wide issue, financing and technology, and you are not surprised that we chose for our partner here Westinghouse, an American company who is going to be the partner of our state-run company, and this is the beginning of changing our energy mix.
With that, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel here.